In Rwanda, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you all here today for this launch of Rwanda's trade report. My name is Antoine Kajangwe. I'm the Director General in charge of Trade and Industry, and I will be your MC for this session. On behalf of the Ministry of Trade and Industry and the World Bank Rwanda office, we're grateful for you for accepting our invitation to participate in this important launch under the theme, Fostering Rwanda's Competitiveness and Resilience and Making the Most of Regional Integration and the AFCFTA in the post-COVID-19 era. The process of developing this comprehensive trade report for Rwanda began in 2021 as part of the World Bank's Rwanda Economic Update Report, a seminal biannual report developed. This trade report offers an opportunity to reflect on where Rwanda's trade agenda is succeeding, where it needs to be strengthened. Broadly, the trade report considers Rwanda's trade performance in relation to regional partners and the rest of the world. It considers the improving export receipts as expansion is seen in both trade in goods and trade in services and diversification of products. It takes notes of the reform agenda to develop a conducive business environment, which has resulted in the attraction of domestic and foreign direct investment. The report also reviews Rwanda's regional integration agenda and considers research and analysis conducted on the impact of joining regional blocs like the EAC, COMESA, the AFCFTA, and ECAS. Trade facilitation and trade logistics also feature prominently in the trade report, highlighting Rwanda's potential as a regional logistics hub. Finally, the role of services in driving Rwanda's economic growth, export revenues, and industrial development is expounded on in a section on fostering trade and services. So it's my distinct pleasure at this point to welcome you all once again to this session. And as we enter into this exciting discussion, just to consider a few housekeeping rules. Please feel free to intervene at any point during this discussion. It will be as interactive as possible. We'll have mics moving around for any who wish to intervene at any point. For those who would like access to the Wi-Fi, there are small placards in front of you on your desks for those who wish to use them. And finally, if you could place your phones on silence or on vibration so as not to disturb the meeting. Finally, our agenda will be brief. We'll hear opening remarks from the World Bank country manager, Ms. Rwanda Price, to set the stage, and to be followed by a keynote address from the Honorable Minister of Trade. Thereafter, we'll consider two presentations on the Rwanda Trade Report, to be followed by a short presentation on the AFCFTA economic and distributional effects and the role of FDI in boosting growth and reducing poverty. At this point, allow me to welcome Rwanda Price to share a few remarks. Thank you.
The time I leave this country, I'm going to be completely smooth on that, Honorable Minister, but I'm still struggling. Minister of Trade and Industry, Lucy and Shuti Mbabaze, Head of Africa Advocacy and Partnerships of the Better Than Cash Alliance, which is hosted by the UN Capital Development Fund. Distinguished government representatives, including P.S. Richard and DG Tony from Minicom and other agencies, distinguished private sector representatives, welcome, ambassadors, high commissioners, and heads of development agencies, esteemed guests, friends, all protocols observed. I've left out my colleagues from the World Bank. Many of them are here. It's not because I don't love you, but you're part of the crew. Mbahazi Ikaze, Mahaye Ikaze, I have the pleasure to welcome you all to the dissemination event for this important Rwanda trade report, which is about fostering Rwanda's competitiveness and resilience in the post-COVID-19 era. We anticipate that this report will be relevant for a wide audience of policymakers, business leaders, analysts of Rwanda's economy, civil society, and other important market participants. I would like to thank Minicom for close collaboration and express appreciation to the Ministry of Finance, to the National Bank of Rwanda, and to the National Institute of Statistics of Rwanda for their generous contribution during the preparation of this report. The data and insights provided by these institutions have validated the substance and shaped the recommendations that are laid out here and will be discussed today. I would also like to acknowledge the contribution to this flagship trade report of my colleagues. This was a joint effort from several parts of the World Bank. The World Bank Group, including IFC, of course, the Global Trade Team, head by Sebastian, who you will hear from later, the Global Investment Team, as well as the private sector team. Permit me to briefly outline some of the main analytical conclusions and policy recommendations from the trade report. Analysis of bilateral trade and firm-level data yields several insights into Rwanda's export performance. Rwanda has been a leader in increasing international trade over the past 2 decades. Its 17% growth per year from 2010, on average, from 2010 to 2019, was way above global and Africa trends. Rwandan firms have increased their participation in international trade over the last decade to levels exceeding that of regional and continental peers. In 2019, 21% of formal firms exported at least 1% of their sales. For the services sector, that share was 26%. However, exports to regional partners have almost stagnated, and Rwanda remains a less open country than the middle-income countries that the government aspires to match. So there is still some work to do. With regard to policy, Rwanda has been a leader in terms of reforms. Since 2000, the government has adopted a wide range of reforms to stimulate export growth, including improving the investment climate significantly, joining the EAC, COMESA, ICAS, and now more recently, the AFCFTA. Rwanda is one of the most open African countries on trade and services and has achieved substantial progress on trade facilitation, leading to drastic reduction in trade costs in the most recent decade. Rwanda's ranking on the World Bank's Logistics Performance Index, by example, jumped from 148 globally in 2007 to 62 in 2016. The AFC, indeed, the AFCFTA has the potential to be a game changer, Africa as a whole. For Rwanda in particular, it provides significant opportunities to spur Rwanda's trade and income. A new World Bank report on making the most of the African Continental Free Trade Area estimates that the AFCFTA has the potential to raise Rwanda's exports by almost 7% and Rwanda's income by 4% by 2035. However, existing challenges to regional and international trade include high trade logistics costs at the regional and domestic levels, discriminatory non-tariff barriers, security concerns, which from time to time lead to temporary border closures, and a skills deficit that constrains the growth potential for high-skilled services exports. The report emphasizes a few key priorities going forward. First, given the evidence on the strong relationship between ISO certification and exporting, resources spent on increasing awareness and dissemination of information regarding application and filing procedures may help Rwandan entrepreneurs realize and maximize their exporting potential. Second, given increasing trade opportunities with the DRC, policies could focus on achieving the same level of integration with the DRC and the rest of the economic community of the Central African states as that with the EAC, through aligning the two regions' tariff rates and improving coordination and harmonization of trade procedures. Third, Rwanda should pursue its leadership role in advancing the AFCFTA agenda and leverage this free trade agreement's preferential market access to secure new opportunities for Rwandan firms. Fourth, Rwanda should implement a new generation of trade facilitation and logistics reforms, the others were so successful, to further reduce trade costs at the regional and domestic level, including, notably, expanding its role as a logistics hub through continued investment in infrastructure and policy changes, achieving a regional agreement on a legal framework for multimodal transport, and enhancing efficiency of trucking firms. Finally, Rwanda should consider pursuing further bilateral and multilateral agreements to improve the regulatory framework for digital services, to improve access to export opportunities. For example, there is a chance to engage more intensively in the WTO space on issues of importance for the country's services trade and take that opportunity to influence the agreements reached, as well as to learn about best practices in services regulation. This is still an opportunity that we have yet to fully take advantage of. I have to say that the World Bank remains committed to promoting regional integration and international trade in general, and specifically in Rwanda, given the importance for improving this country's resilience against global shocks, supporting growth, and reducing poverty. You know that our mission at the World Bank Group is to end extreme poverty and to promote shared prosperity, that is to grow the incomes of the bottom 40% of the population. We deploy a variety of different instruments to support the development of technology capacities, trade, and regional integration, specifically in Rwanda. The recently closed $26 million Great Lakes Trade Facilitation Project helped to facilitate cross-border trade by increasing the capacity for commerce and reducing the costs faced by traders, especially small-scale and female traders, at targeted locations in the borderlands. The $100 million Rwanda Digital Acceleration Project, and in fact, that project is $200 million because it is co-financed by the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. So we will have $200 million of impact. This is under implementation, and it aims to position Rwanda as a regional hub for digital innovation and entrepreneurship. It includes development of local entrepreneurial support organizations, early stage finance for startups, the development of advanced digital skills, digital literacy, and support towards the development of an innovation policy for the country, among other activities. Finally, we are currently preparing a $250 million development policy operation, which is focused on private sector investment and green growth to support a new generation of trade reforms. I very much look forward to what I believe is going to be a fruitful discussion on the challenges and solutions to accelerate regional integration and boost participation of Rwandan firms in international trade. We look forward to your active participation, and I urge you, as the Director General did, to raise your hand at any time and to intervene. We want an active exchange and engagement. We also, at the end of these opening statements, will have a panel that really will create a space, I think, to have a back and forth with some of the experts who worked on these reports. And now I have the pleasure to invite the Honorable Minister, Jean Chrysostome Gabetsinze, Minister of Trade and Industry, to deliver his keynote address. I thank you.
Thank you, Roland. Ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed. We are honored to be here, myself and my colleagues, PS, DGs, staff from Minicom, to say that we are very happy to have this report, and our collaboration with World Bank is giving us sustainable results through data analysis. And as a ministry, we never influence data, we just learn from data. I will not say many things because Roland passed through some findings of the report. Our presence here is to hear from you, from the findings, from the recommendations, and from there, we can formulate new policies, revise what we have, and propose some sustainable projects. Trade, just in terms of a word, is very small, but in impact is very important. Today, under globalization, today, under cooperation and collaboration through countries, only the world will be able to achieve together sustainable income generation and wealth for the population. Rwanda, we recognize our position in terms of geographical or political situation or political economy depend on how our country, our people are open to others. And we are really open. Where we are closed, we learn every day to be open more. 2009, 2008, 2009, when the world had a financial crisis, some countries protected and they closed their economy. The results were very, very terrible. They were very negative. When you have shocks, you don't close, you just open. Because through openness, you can have a way to gain something. During COVID, it was very hard to all countries in the world. Now, after sometimes the war in Ukraine and Russia caused other problems in our economies. But as a country, Rwanda, we have been able to be open, even during the shocks we had from logistics issues, from transportation. We try to make sure that our Rwanda can move according to measures we had. So we believe on trade. The performance is just a result of efforts. We are not performing well. We are here to make sure that we can plan for next years ahead, 2035, 2050. So it's a process of learning. In Minicom, as a Minister of Trade and Industry, we think to make sure that you are competitive, you must have industrialization process very strong. Because the product you have to send to the market, if you consider, for example, African Continental Free Trade, now we are under the phase of trying the piloting phase where we send some product, the guided trade initiative where we are participating, the protocols under revision and approval, approved by ministers of trade and industry. Very soon they will be approved by heads of state. Those are the documents to support what we do. But as a country, we hope to create around what we do efficiency to make sure that we can have a comparative advantage. We will not be able to trade everything, but we trade where we can have good money and good health for our people. So we take into consideration any suggestion and we open our heart, our will, our mind to make sure that everything coming to us as a ministry, as a sector, we sit and you analyze and you understand. So my role today was to welcome you, to tell you that we know the report, we discussed the report, we know the findings. Now you can add what is out of the report. So don't be just closed on the report itself. Be open to add on, to give us more inputs, and for sure we'll give you feedback. So Wish you good discussions. I will stay until after the video, if you see an agenda, because after you will go to visit some of our agencies. But we are together as a ministry. PS will remain. DG Tony, I see our specialists, our directors. So the ministry is present. Our senior officials are here. So we have in our heart. And as I've said, we believe on data. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. Thank you very much, Country Manager, for those remarks. I think there was a lot that was said, and I won't repeat too much of it, but just to highlight a statement which I think was very profound from the Honorable Minister. Trade is a small word, but the impact is important. And indeed, this is true. Trade and its role for Rwanda's development and where it has gotten Rwanda, I think, has been reflected by the remarks from the country manager in terms of becoming a leader, really in terms of export growth on the continent, but also the participation of Rwandan firms, both in trade in goods and trade in services. And indeed, this report helps to expand on some of that analysis and some of those findings and paints a picture for where we need to go. And so at this point, let me welcome Mr. Calvin Dishfrak, the Senior Country Economist at the World Bank, to share a short presentation on the trade report, and also welcome Ms. Marla Malzawaka, okay, a senior economist. I will also get it at some point before I leave. A senior economist at the World Bank to share on the AFCFTA. So you're both welcome.
Honorable Minister, dear guests, thank you so much to all of you for making the time for us to discuss the Rwanda Trade Report this morning. The presentation that we are going to make will be structured around 4 points. The first one to very quickly talk about the Rwanda trade performance. Then we will discuss a little bit some of the challenges that facing trade in the country. The third point will be about the priority area for the reform going forward. And we will end the presentation mainly by my colleague discussing how Rwanda could leverage the African Free Trade Agreement to secure new opportunities for his firms. Let's just first go through some of the key messages of the report. The first one, what the country manager said already, is that Rwanda has been an important performer. Rwanda total trade export increasing significantly over the past 2 decades, driven notably by important reduction in trade costs in both the central and northern corridors. The second one is that the export to regional partners is important, but has been stagnant for a couple of years, and that Rwanda still remains relatively less open to compare to the country at the same level of development, the same size of the economy, but most importantly, compared to the ambition that the country, in fact, the development ambition of the country of upper middle income countries. The third message is that the impact of the COVID has been very important, drastic in the country. The service sector, like in many other countries, has been the most affected. The regional trade also has been more affected in Rwanda compared to international trade. We discussed it a bit more. The fourth message is that Rwanda should reshape his regional trade policy, foster to improve the industrialization and optimize the benefit from emerging trade opportunities at the regional and international level. The fourth is the implementation of the new generation of trade facilitation reform, including the regional logistic hub, could further reduce trade costs at the regional but domestic level as well. The last message that trading technology, capacity, innovation will be important to strengthen further trade in Rwanda. Let us move to the first part of the report, which is about the trade performance. So this graph here basically displays the increase of the total trade in Rwanda, average growth per year, total trade, both service and good. And you can see that the average growth for Rwanda the previous decade before the COVID was around 14%. This to be compared to just 3% for the world and 2% for the Sub-Saharan Africa. So this is quite impressive as performance. One of the way also to see the trade performance of Rwanda is through this graph, where using the World Bank Enterprise Survey, in fact, we try to know what are the number of Rwanda firms participating actually to international trade, those selling at least, having at least 1% of their sales, in fact, at international. And you can see that Rwanda is clearly, in fact, the leader among African countries with more than 21% of his total firms participating to international trade. And this has been, in fact, an important improvement because in 2006, this share was just 11%. If we try, in fact, to understand what is behind this evolution, I'll tell you that the service sector has been the main driver of this increasing participation because the share of formal Rwanda firms participating to international trade, in fact, in 2019, in that World Bank Enterprise Survey, is around 26%. And this clearly reflects, in fact, the government strategy that really put a particular emphasis on the services as that can be seen in the national strategy in the NST1. Yeah, so we have these good performances, but what we have to underline is that the very good performance was going from relatively low points. And because we were going from relatively low points, Rwanda is still relatively less open compared to the country with the same size. That's basically what we are seeing in this graph here. This is only about the export. If we look at the export, we can see here, in fact, that Rwanda, compared to other countries, is below this curve. The curve is basically showing us the average. So any country under the curve, in fact, is performing lower than the average. So Rwanda is with the level of openness of export of around 20 to 24% is less than the peer. But most importantly, to understand, in fact, the challenge of the openness is to go to this table right here, where we make an estimate considering a bundle of countries at the level of development that Rwanda would like to reach, the upper middle income countries. So the question is, what should be the level of openness of Rwanda to be at that level? So on this table, we are seeing in 2020, the level of openness of the country was around 20% of GDP. I'm talking here about the export because if we take into account the import is going to be higher. So in 2024, our projection is about 27. But to be at the level of upper middle income in 2035, the country will need to be at 46% of GDP in terms of his trade export. So this is actually the target. As many of you know, to reach that target of upper middle income, Rwanda will need to be growing at the rate of 12% a year. So to generate that growth of 12%, you need those levels of trade openness. At least this is what we have been seeing in the country, in fact, reaching those performances. What we have here on this particular slide is another way to assess the performance of the country, just to take a look at what has been happening in terms of trade with regional partners. So I have to say that the EAC, so we have to be clear on that, is the most successful regional integration in Africa. And the EAC has been very good, in fact, to Rwanda, particularly at the beginning. At the beginning in 2000 and 2009, in fact, Rwanda was exporting more than 21% of its total trade in goods, in fact, to EAC country. However, in the following years, the total amount of trade with those countries stayed very much about the same level. And here I'm talking about the EAC before, of course, the integration of DRC. Okay, because the trade stay at the same level, that level, in fact, of the trade, the share of trade to the EAC declined a little bit over time. But the good news is that Rwanda actually also explored and was able to take advantage, in fact, of an increasing new opportunity in DRC, where you can see clearly, in fact, on this graph, that the country, how the trade with the country increased. So Rwanda is now trading more with the DRC than with all the EAC countries combined. It's actually 3 times if we are considering just trade in goods. So this graph here, in fact, is just to talk a little bit about what has been the impact of the COVID on the trade performances in Rwanda. So the result that we have in Rwanda was somehow a little bit different from what we are seeing over the world. So you can see here, we are just discussing here about the trade in goods. We all know how catastrophic the trade in service for all the countries, in fact, has been. So the impact of the COVID was very bad, in fact, for trade in service, not just in Rwanda, but this was overall situation around the world, right? And we know, by the way, that Rwanda has also very much recovered, in fact, from the situation that they were in during the COVID in terms of the tourism, for example. The last time that I checked the number, in this year, the frequentation of the tourism was almost at 80% of its level before the COVID crisis. It's possible that the number is even better at this time. But what I wanted to show you, in fact, on this particular slide, is that actually in 2020 during the COVID, trade in goods actually went out in total because we have in Rwanda, in fact, the installation of new refinery company for the gold, in fact. And as a result, the export of gold went up for more than 140%. That's what is giving us this increase of trade to the international destination. However, trade to the regions went down by 50%. So, and this is actually a result that's a little bit different from what we see in other countries, where regional trade has been relatively resilient. So the World Bank have a couple of reports on this, where we see regional trade being relatively resilient. And I believe one of the explanations why we have this in Rwanda is because this coincides also to the period where we had border closure with Uganda and Burundi. So this decline that we are seeing here is also accounting a little bit for that. So let me move to the second part of the presentation, which about the challenge, but also actually the huge achievement of Rwanda on the policy ground. So we are trying to assess 4 areas here: trade policy, trade facilitation, security challenges, and specific barrier to trade in services, given the importance of this sector for the country. So in terms of the trade policy, I'm just going to repeat what the country manager just said. Rwanda has been truly a leader in terms of trade policy, in terms of reforming his trade policy. Since 2000, the government has adopted a wide range of reforms to stimulate the export growth. You can see in this table number of trade agreements, number of free trade area that the government tried, in fact, to integrate. We are talking about EAC, COMESA, ECAS, and now the AFCTA, for which Rwanda is now one of the leaders, in fact, of the leader in the continent. So the country has done a lot, in fact, for this, and this somehow, I believe, in fact, is what explaining the very impressive trade performance that we saw on my first slide. However, we still have, in fact, there are margins to improve, or this already very good effort by the government, in fact, in terms of reforming trade. So some area, in fact, of improvement will include, for example, the deviation from the EAC common schedule tariff. And this is not something that is specific to Rwanda. We are just talking about the EAC setup in general. So the analysis is showing that selective increase of tariff above the common external tariff, in fact, by many partners countries, contributed to make this regional integration relatively less attractive. So one of the most important features, the most important advantage of a free trade agreement is literally, in fact, to have that common external tariff. But if you are having so many exceptions, that will reduce this attractiveness. You can see on this graph here, this graph is telling us that in 2020, we have 7% of import coming into a EAC, coming into different tariff. In fact, it was not coming into the common external tariff. And if you are making this assessment in terms of number of products, in terms of tariff line of product imported, actually the share is 11%. So another challenge here, in fact, is the so-called exception list that we have, in fact, in the EAC. In fact, the EAC arrangement allow his country to have a list of sensitive products. And that list of sensitive products, the countries are allowed to apply a tariff that could range from 30 to 100%. So just for your information, normal CAT, normal EAC tariff arrangement is that you should not be having a rate that's above 25%. So one of the challenges here is that many of those products to which we have a tariff relatively high being applied are products that are imported in countries like Rwanda as input for other products that may be exported. So having this high export on selected product may be hampering, maybe causing, maybe hurting a little bit Rwanda competitiveness and his potential to industrialize and export even more. Let me move to the trade facilitation. And I have to say, you were really right to applaud when the country manager talked about the LPI, the World Bank Logistic Performance Index, because this is really one area where Rwanda did very well. And it's actually one area, as a landlocked country, it's one area where Rwanda have no choice but to do well, actually, in fact, to really address his trade costs. So we can see that the cost of transporting a container from Dar es Salaam to Kigali went down from 2.81 per kilometer in 2013 to 1.87 in 2020. We can also see that there have been important improvement in time and reliability of supply chain. So there have been reforms that drastically reduce the clearance time, improve the reliability and the predictability of supply chains. And some of these reforms include the introduction of a one-stop border post, the starting clearance before goods arrive, moving final clearance of goods away from the border to points of destination. So this helped a lot. And there's also the use of electronic cargo tracking system to keep track of goods and trucks in transit across international boundary. So all this reform is what contributed to this decline in the costs that you are seeing here and to the improvement of the logistic performance index of the World Bank that you can have there. Yes, so here too, despite very important effort, there's still something that can be done, in fact, to do even better. And among all those areas is really, in fact, the assessment that the most important progress when it comes to trade facilitation, when it comes to reducing the trade of costs, really happen on the international trade flows, in fact. So, however, when it comes to the regional exchange, the trade with neighbors, notably new trade destinations like the DRC, so the cost is still relatively higher, in fact, with those countries. And we can see on this graph, I'm not sure to what extent it's very visible, but on this graph, the one at the top, we can see that the trade costs, in fact, with the DRC remain almost the same since the last 10 years, in fact. This is something that we can understand, right? Because some of the reforms that happen to allow us to reduce the trade, of course, the trade costs from transporting goods from Dar es Salaam for example, to Kigali. This happened also because we have the EAC. So the EAC provides that framework, in fact, to really collaborate and make improvement, in fact, on trade facilitation. The DRC was not part of the EAC at that moment. So this is really, in fact, a new area where progress can be made. Yes, improving also the trade facilitation with neighbors, including DRC. So one area of a challenge when it comes to the trade costs is something that's completely linked to the geography, the specific nature of Rwanda, because we have relatively difficult terrain in the country, so which make it relatively costly to transport goods from one area to another, in fact, in Rwanda. And we have this estimate from one study of the World Bank showing that because of those difficulties, that difficult terrain, in fact, that geography, that's make it relatively difficult in Rwanda. The cost of transporting a good, in fact, from one area to another, on average in Rwanda, will be 10 times higher compared to the US, 5 times compared to the Nigeria and 3 times compared to Ethiopia. That's another landlocked country. So let me move to the next area of challenge that we are seeing, which about the security challenge. So because, as you know, because of the security challenges, the country has been obliged, in fact, to have his border closed, 2 borders closed for some time, but both borders are now open, okay? I'm talking about Uganda and Burundi. So with Burundi, the border has been closed for more than 58 months, Uganda more than 38 months. And this, of course, is something that may have impact on trade through many channels. The informal trade, in fact, went down from what we can see, in fact, the trade going to Uganda, but to the region in general. However, there was also trade diversion. So at the same time that trade to Uganda was going down, you can see an important increase of the trade going to Tanzania, which contributed to really attenuate that effect of the border closure. And yes, however, the result is that this increased a little bit the time of transporting goods, of the good coming, in fact, from overseas. And this, in fact, is something that could create an uncertainty and hurt relatively. It's not the major determinant, but it's not something that's relatively good, in fact, for the ambition of becoming a regional logistic hub, because you need really some certainty, some predictability, in fact, on that. I just want to go to the specific challenge related to the service. And I'm going to start being repetitive, but I'm just going to start here once again telling you that Rwanda has been a champion in terms of liberalizing, opening his trade in service. You have seen the result. So those results actually really reflect the policy achievement that we have here. So this, what you have here on the table, this chart, is the ad valorem equivalent of protection on trade in service. When we are comparing Rwanda with selected countries in Africa. And for those countries for which the data is available, you can see Rwanda right here is the country with the lowest rate, okay, the lowest protection. So Rwanda is really open for the business when it comes to trade in service. And our assessment is that Rwanda has the low level of restriction on service required for successful development of service-based economy. So that is important. And we also have one assessment here that's showing you that Rwanda trade regime for some specific important trade in service like banking, distribution, and road freight is at similar level, in fact, as the average of many OECD countries. And here again, there could be margin of improvement. And there are 2 specific areas, particularly where we believe, in fact, improvement could be made to make the service sector, in fact, even more competitive in Rwanda. So the first one is about the digital policy, the digital trade policy, that remain relatively restrictive in Rwanda compared to other Africa. As you know, firms involved in international trade need to meet foreign data protection norms, for example, in order to access and protect the data to provide services to clients. So in the case of Rwanda, there's a requirement that data must be stored and processed locally and be accessible to relevant government authority. So this is considered, in fact, as relatively restrictive. And regulations are particularly important in some specific sectors of importance for Rwanda, the sector of finance, for example, because we are talking here about the data in the sector of finance. The data sharing, the circulation of data across border is something that's really fundamental. So one other area where we believe that where the effort, a lot of effort, by the way, is already being made in the country, and where we believe that those government efforts, if they continue, they are going to be very helpful. It's about, in fact, making sure that we have even more skilled service provider in the country. Because as of now, in terms of the skill of service provider, Rwanda is lagging a little bit, in fact, some of the EAC country, but also the major service provider within the continent. If you are talking about Mauritius, South Africa, for example. So this is going to be important, in fact, for Rwanda to achieve his ambition to become a major provider of also high-skill service. So let us move to the recommendations, the way forward. And here we have 5 main areas. The first area is yes, reshaping the trade policy to foster industrialization. So maybe the country could consider renegotiating the EAC tariff schedule band to reduce the list of those exceptions products that are contributing, in fact, to maintain the tariff relatively higher, including for intermediary products that are being used for Rwanda firm exporting. I have to acknowledge that there's already initiative, in fact, to address this issue, in fact, by the government of Rwanda and the EAC country. So there also have to be an improvement in terms of product classification across tariff schedule bands. Because the way, in fact, the tariff structure, in fact, was initially set up within the EAC, it turns out that some of the Rwanda product that should be actually considered as intermediary product and therefore be applied relatively low tariff has been put in the category of final consumption and be applied relatively high tariff. But we also know that there has been recently effort, in fact, to improve this situation. And because we are going to have many policymakers speaking, I'm sure they are going to even provide more detail on those efforts. And I want to also talk about the non-tariff barrier because this is important, particularly for regional integration. And this, once again, is one area where Rwanda has made a lot of effort, in fact, in this area. One recommendation here is just to make it even easier, in fact, for the people to report those non-tariff barriers. But this is clearly one area where the country has made a lot of effort. And one last recommendation in this area is to try, in fact, to achieve the same level of integration with EAC, Economic Community of Central African States, ECAS, as with the EAC. And so just this effort to facilitate even further the exchange with the DRC, which is really becoming the major trade partner of Rwanda. Rwanda is now exporting more to DRC when it comes to trade in goods than any other regional and international partners. So it's really important, something important to consider. So one of the area of reform to consider here is about the implementing a new generation of trade facilitation to further reduce the trade costs. So key improvements that could significantly reduce both external and intermediary costs include improving the efficiency of trucking firms that could improve the trucking service and reduce costs. And here again, I know that there has been a government initiative, in fact, to help the trucking industry to have a relatively new trucks. And having new trucks, because the assessment was that the trucks previously were relatively old. I know that there have been initiatives here, in fact, to have the trucks that are relatively new, that could be more performant and be more competitive compared to the trucks from the neighboring countries that have been dominant, even including in the Rwanda market. So that's one area. The other area is to achieving a regional agreement on legal framework for multimodal transport could also help the trade costs. Also, building railway lines is something that the government has been considering, building railway lines along the central and northern trade corridors. This is something that could really reduce the time of transportation, in fact, by half. But the assessment of the report is just that by doing this, a very careful assessment of the fiscal implication will need to be conducted because based on the experience that we are seeing in Rwanda, Kenya, and also in Ethiopia, those initiatives generally, in fact, are hardly financially sustainable just based on the increasing tariffs, on increasing traffic, please. But yes, so definitively, this initiative that will contribute, in fact, to cut the time of transit of product substantially by 50%. The fourth area of recommendation is about implementing efficient regional logistic hub. So the assessment of the report is really that Rwanda has the potential market, in fact, for provision of logistic service in the country. And the short term, where the most potential line is really with the Eastern DRC, where our assessment is that there's around 1.17 million tons of goods, in fact, that could be transported. And one comparison that is made here is that one of such logistic hubs that exists now between the DRC and DRC coupled belt and Zambia only have to handle 0.6 million of tons. So if we can have 1.17 million tons, in fact, between Rwanda and the Eastern DRC, this tell you that the potential is there. The other area that allow you to see that there's potential, that Rwanda has already made a lot of appropriate policy reform, but also infrastructure, in fact, to make that happen. So some of the area where more could be done, in fact, to be sure that this ambition is really something that achieved, is addressing the high trade costs at border with DRC, something that we have already highlighted, upgrading the logistics service supporting land transport from DRC, and also trying, in fact, to continue the effort to have the EAC open sky arrangement, which will further expand Rwanda network by reducing restrictions on competition. So the last area of recommendation is just about strengthening the quality standard, technology capacity, and innovation. We see this as something, if done, in fact, could improve even for the performance of trade in Rwanda. One of our assessments is the report, in fact, is to see the impact that having the international organization standard certification, how can that impact the participation to international trade? We see in the firm, in fact, having this certification are 36% more likely to participate to international trade. So it will be really important to make investment on awareness, dissemination of information regarding certification, application, and filling procedure to really contribute to the number of firms participating to international trade. The e-commerce is one area where the country has made a lot of effort, including particularly during the COVID crisis. And the report showed that continue those efforts will help even more, in fact, the export in the country. Lastly is about the formal training. So formal training is one of the things that coming from the World Bank Enterprise Survey, where we ask the firm, if the government were to support you to improve your participation to international trade, in which area do you think the government should be helping? Most of them actually point to the training. So this is one very important thing that I wanted to point to you. So this is what the firms in Rwanda are saying is very helpful to them. Last area of recommendation is just what can be done to improve the service trade in the country. We talked already about participation to multilateral and bilateral trade agreement to improve the regulatory framework of service in the country. We talk about also trying, in fact, to boost the skill in the country. And one way to boost those skills of service provider in the country will be through, in fact, the recognition, the mutual recognition agreements. We know that there's already such initiative at EAC level, but it's also about very limited number of products. This could be extended to some critical products for Rwanda, like finance, legal, and consulting professional. So I'm going to stop here and thank you for your attention. Thank you again. Yes, so my colleagues, Marila is going to then discuss a little bit, in fact, the African Free Trade Agreement, how Rwanda can leverage this opportunity, in fact, to improve, boost even further his trade.
Morning, everyone. I think. Good morning, everyone. Honorable Trade Minister, honorable colleagues, guests, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to present our latest work on the AFCFTA. Should I face that screen? Oh. Well, that's like, we're still thankful for your attention, but can you?
Maybe are you showing the wrong presentation? This is the one with.
Maybe it's the.
So.
Okay, I can start with some remarks which don't require any slides, but just to reiterate the remarks of our colleagues, I wanted to stress the importance that the role of trade and the importance it can play in the development challenges that Rwanda is facing and other countries in Africa. Trade can support the recovery from COVID. It can boost growth. It can support the reduction of poverty. The diversification brought about by trade can really build resilience of countries to future shocks. That's extremely critical as well. Trade is part of the solution of to climate change as well. It can provide the critical technologies, goods and services that can support green transition. And finally, it can also deliver opportunities from digital revolution. And an extremely important aspect of trade is that cross-border trade can support the resilience to food security issues. So Honorable Trade Minister mentioned that it's extremely important to keep the trade flows open in the time of crisis. Our recent study shows that export bans, for example, imposed by countries have increased the price of wheat by 17%. So clearly in the times of crisis, keeping the borders open is critical. Now, however, a range of opportunities in terms of regional value chains remain unexploited. And it's mostly because of thick borders, high trade costs, and some unfavorable trade policies. So I'm really, so I think it's really critical to look at trade in terms of comprehensive and integrated approach, in terms of looking at trade, at tariffs, trade policy, non-tariff measures in goods and services, trade facilitation, logistics, regulations in services. So the trade report that my colleague Calvin has just presented is an excellent work that discusses all of those different elements. So it's great to follow up on this. What I wanted to discuss today is the report that we have concluded recently. It's on the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement and the implications for and its opportunities that it brings in terms of boosting trade, investment, growth, and reducing poverty and income inequality. Some of you are familiar with the report that we published in 2020. It was our first report on the AFCFTA, where we focus specifically on the distributional impacts and the economic gains from the agreement. Recently, we have released the second report, where in addition to studying the implications of the reduction of tariffs, NTMs in goods and services, and trade facilitation, which are the measures that we considered in the first report, we have also looked at the implications of AFCFTA for foreign direct investment. So, so taking this analysis a bit further to look what are the opportunities that the AFCFTA creates in terms of boosting FDI intra-Africa and extra-Africa FDI. And I was hoping to have the slides by now to walk you through the numbers, but I think this introduction is helpful anyway, because I've already discussed the key issues that we are discussing in the report. I can grab my presentation. You need me to connect, I have it here, but would you connect the laptop? Or?
No, just continue presenting while I try to.
Okay. So in order to save time, I will keep going without the slides, if that's okay with you. So my presentation, well, I just wanted to mention that we have hard copies of the report on some of the tables. So hopefully, if you're interested, you can grab a copy or a copy of the report. It's also available on the World Bank website. And hopefully soon I'll be able to show you the cover and the details. My presentation is just, I wanted to select 3 key issues to focus on. One, I wanted to give you a very brief update on the AFCFTA and the negotiations of the agreement. Second, I wanted to walk through the implications of the AFCFTA for the continent as a whole. And finally, I wanted to focus specifically on what are the opportunities for Rwanda. In terms of the state of play under AFCFTA, just a brief summary, because I'm sure most of you are really familiar with where it's headed. But as of today, 44 countries have ratified the agreement. And the tariff offers have been provided by most countries, but there are still issues related to the rules of origin. There is 12% of the products where those are still under negotiations. That pertains to some of the textile and apparel goods and automotive products. And the Guided Trade Initiative that was launched in October this year, including Rwanda as well, really hopes to boost trade and under AFCFTA rules. Okay, perfect. We are getting there. Perfect. Yay, thank you so much. Okay, let me advance. So this is the report I've been see now. Okay, perfect. Okay. Here, I just wanted to briefly mention that it's a joint report with the AFCFTA Secretariat, and it's a follow-up to an earlier report, like I said. So I'm just going to advance very quickly, I went through the three main elements of the presentation. So let me just, in the interest of time, let me continue. So the key elements of trading goods, I've already mentioned them. Moving on to trading services, we'll have a session soon in the afternoon talking about the ambitions of the negotiations on the trading services and where they're headed. But as of November, 47 countries have submitted their offers. The protocol on competition policy investment in IPR was approved in October, and there are still a couple of protocols that are under negotiation. So protocol on women and youth in trade and digital trade. Also, the next session on AFCFTA will delve deeper into the investment protocol. So just an introduction and to let you know that's in case you're interested to. It keeps okay. Okay, so let me walk you very briefly through these three scenarios that we've considered in our report. So as I mentioned earlier, the 2020 report looked at the reduction in tariffs, non-tariff measures in goods and services brought about by the AFCFTA, and trade facilitation measures. What we found back then was really the biggest gains are likely to come from trade facilitation measures, followed by NTM reductions, and the smallest gains would be from trade reduction of tariffs alone, which is not a surprising result given that the ongoing liberalization of tariffs at the continent has already made significant progress. So really the highest barriers are posed by non-tariff measures in goods and services and the trade costs. So here in this report, we go further. We look at two additional scenarios. The first one, which we called FDI broad, it's really just looking at what are the potential FDI inflows that will be driven by the fact that countries are now joined into a single agreement. So instead of having spaghetti bowl of different countries belonging to different tracks, there are benefits from putting them all into one single agreement under a common set of rules. But of course, this is not AFCFTA's ambition is not to be just a simple shallow FTA. The ambition is to harmonize rules and regulations, and this is going to further reduce trade costs and boost FDI. So that scenario we called FDI deep. And let me just mention here that we've used a variety of tools and approaches, and I'm not going to discuss them here, but if anyone is particularly keen to learn about them, I'm happy to discuss them after the session. There are several caveats related to this work. It was done before COVID, so there could be some additional updates given the changes in commodity prices, the Ukraine war. But these numbers, I just want to make it very clear, these are not projections. What the analytical work that we do is a scenario analysis. So just considering the implications of different scenarios and looking what the implications on growth, on poverty reduction, on sectoral reallocation could be. So not projection, scenario analysis. And what's important also to note here that when you look at the results, we look at the implications in 2035. And basically how it works, we create a baseline without AFCFTA and see the growth, the expected poverty reduction, trade increases under the baseline that does not include AFCFTA. And then we run our scenarios and compare the difference. So these are the gains of in intra-regional trade flows, export and imports at the continental level that we would anticipate to see with the most ambitious scenarios. And we see that intra-African trade is expected to, let me see if I can point it, to grow by basically double as compared to what it would have been if the agreement was not fully implemented. The overall boost to trade is about 30%, but the biggest gains are, and its percentage increases would be expected in manufacturing, but also with significant gains in services and agriculture. So moving on to the next slide. So I'm sorry, very briefly. So what's driving the increase in trade and FDI? It's the reduction of tariffs and TMs having a common set of rules. And we believe that it has the potential to increase the FDI within Africa and external FDI flows significantly. So in our scenarios, we see the increase in intra-African FDI of between 50 to 70%, and also a significant boost to flows from outside of Africa, attracted by the opportunities created by FDI. And we see that it could more than double compared to what it would have been without the agreement. So significant gains could be realized if the agreement proceeds as expected. So just to conclude the overall impacts on the continent before I move quickly to the implications for Rwanda, our estimated income gains are that the income at the continent has the potential to be 9% higher in 2035 relative to what it would have been in the baseline without the AFCFTA. And of course, the implications vary by countries. And the biggest gains accrue to countries with the highest initial trade cost and trade barriers, because that's where the liberalization has the biggest gains. We see that exports could increase by 32%, and the AFCFTA has the potential to leave 50 million additional people compared to what we would have anticipated in 2035. So yes, the gains are significant and important. Let me move now to discuss the implications for Rwanda. It takes a while too. Okay, perfect. So this is where we look again at the gains from the AFCFTA in 2035, and these are the income gains under different scenarios. So the first are the gains under the trade agreement, so just tariffs and TMs, trade facilitation, and we see that the FDI boosts income growth by about 1%. 1 percentage point relative to the trade reforms. Now, these are really conservative estimates, and I think it has to do a lot with the methodology that we use, the gravity estimate, that is associated with several caveats. There is no dynamic gains, there is no learning by doing, the productivity increases are not there. So we really anticipate the gains to be much higher, but these are the conservative estimates that are based on the existing tools that we have. And just to give you an estimate of the FDI inflows, additional FDI inflows brought about by AFCFTA, it's about 56% for Rwanda under the shallow agreement and 75 boost to potential FDI flows from the deeper agreement. We also expect significant gains in intra-African trade for Rwanda. So these income gains are similar to what you've just seen on the are the same as in the previous slide, but just these are the potential increases in exports between about 9.5%. But we see that the exports to AFCFTA partners are growing much faster at about 40%. Finally, sorry, it's just Okay. Finally, we're really keen to see what are the potential sectoral reallocations, and our model covers about 30 sectors, but here we just highlight some of the implications. So what the boost to trade and FDI results in sectoral reallocation. So some sectors are likely to grow faster, and all of them are growing as the economy expands between today and 2035. But what the AFCFTA does, it changes the structure of the economy, not to a large degree, but it gives a boost to agriculture and food processing by boosting trade in those and FDI in those sectors, to other services, and also to construction and retail and rail transport. And it's in this model, there is a reallocation of employment from sectors that are relatively less competitive, or for example, trade services gone down despite significant boost to trade. It's because of trade facilitation reform. You simply need less trade services to transport the same amount of goods. So this also has implications for wages, and it's really linked to the type of employment that's typical for those sectors. So let's say if there is a lot of female workers working in agriculture and output of agriculture grows a bit faster than other sectors, that would give a boost to female workers. So what we see in the case of Rwanda, which is not the case for all countries, but is that the wages of female workers would, everyone benefits, both female, male, skilled, unskilled wages are growing faster. But what we see that the wages of female workers and unskilled workers are growing a little bit faster because of the nature of the sectors that are expanding a bit faster under AFCFTA. And just to give you that's the last concluding slide. These are the numbers of the people that could be lifted out of poverty due to the AFCFTA. And so in 2035, we would anticipate 250 million people lifted out of extreme poverty and 430 out of moderate poverty, which are defined as $1.90 a day and $3.20 respectively. And just to conclude, of course, this will only be possible if the negotiations conclude with the very ambitious agenda, and if this ambitious agenda is implemented. This is what we'll be discussing at the workshop after lunch, the workshop focusing on the AFCFTA. And just to conclude, the World Bank is there to help in terms of investment operations, to remove barriers to Africa's trade and leverage the AFCFTA to boost growth and reduce poverty. And that's something that Sebastian will be discussing in his remark. Thank you so much, and apologies for taking longer than expected.
Thank you very much, Marla and Calvin, for those very exciting presentations. I think they paint a really comprehensive picture of Rwanda's trade performance over the last 10 years or so, and really into the next 15, 30 years in line with Vision 2035 and 2050. At this juncture, we're going to view a short video just summarizing the presentations that have just been delivered, and then we'll open it up for the public for questions and comments, and we have discussants to help set the stage. But at this point, let me ask colleagues on the digital devices to just display the video, and then we'll take it from there. Thanks.
The COVID-19 pandemic has had a negative impact on the economy, but looking at Rwanda's trade performance, there's potential to boost competitiveness and build resilience in the post-COVID era. Here's a glance at Rwanda's trade performance, challenges, and policy recommendations to help improve performance going forward. In terms of trades in goods, Rwanda's international trade has been growing over the past 2 decades with an increase of 14.5% a year from 260 million US dollars in 2000 to 4 billion US dollars in 2020. And in service trade, the service sector contributed substantially to exports in Rwanda in recent years, with 9% increase per year between 2010 and 2019 to more than 2 billion US dollars. In fact, before the COVID-19 pandemic, tourism was Rwanda's leading foreign exchange earner, accounting for nearly 45% of service exports in 2019. It's notable that Rwanda's exports are becoming more sophisticated, moving towards resource-based exports and high-tech products. Now, let's zoom out to look at a slightly bigger picture. Rwanda's trade openness is still relatively low in comparison to other countries with the same population size. Rwanda's exports of goods and services is 21.1% of GDP compared to 22.4% for low-income small countries, and it's considerably below the average for middle-income small countries, which is 34.7%. Now let's look at Rwanda's regional trade performance. Rwanda's total exports increased by 17% from 2010 to 2019. After joining the East African community, Rwanda's exports of goods to the EAC member countries more than doubled in the following 3 years, thanks to a reduction in the average tariff. However, since 2012, Rwanda's exports to EAC have almost stagnated. So what have the challenges been? Rwanda has been a leader in trade reforms. However, there's still room for improvement. For example, deviations from the EAC common tariff schedules are disruptive. Trade facilitation is going well, but there are ways to improve this even further. The cost of trading with faraway countries is lower than the cost of trading with nearby countries. For example, thanks to reforms on processing and clearance of goods coming through the seaports of Dar es Salaam and Mombasa, it's cheaper to trade with overseas countries. But costs to trade with DRC, an emerging trade destination for Rwanda, remain particularly high and have not declined in the last 10 years. Rwanda has also made significant progress in reducing non-tariff barriers in recent years, but there are opportunities to take more steps forward. Technical regulations, non-harmonized sanitary and phytosanitary requirements, and complex rules of origin requirements still limit intra-East Africa community trade. Rwanda has a narrow export base due to limited supply and the fact that its exports are very similar to those of other East African Community member countries. Against the backdrop of challenges mentioned, here are some recommendations to help improve Rwanda's trade performance. Developing a coherent regional trade policy to foster industrialization by reducing the list of exceptions and improving product classification across EAC's tariff schedule bands. Accelerating coordination and harmonization of trade procedures between Economic Community of Central African States, ECAS, and EAC to optimize benefits of increasing trade opportunities with DRC. Pursuing a leadership role in advancing the AFCFTA agenda and leveraging the AFCFTA preferential market access to secure new opportunities for Rwandan firms. Implementing new generation of trade facilitation reforms and developing an effective logistics hub to unlock regional opportunities and further reduce trade costs. And addressing supply-side challenges by strengthening quality standards, technology, and innovation so that more Rwandan farms can participate in international trade. Continuing to provide incentives to farms for formal training of their workforce. Rwanda's journey towards becoming a middle-income country by 2035 continues, and implementing policy reforms will play a critical role in achieving this ambitious goal.
Thank you very much. I think that was a brilliantly produced video that helps to capture and summarize a lot of the findings from this trade report. Indeed, a lot has been shared by our two presenters, Marla and Calvin, and just wanted to appreciate you for the diligent work and presentations that you've been able to share with us. Before I open it up to the audience to share their remarks, want to invite some of our discussants here today in the room to share their views, their perception and interpretation of the presentations that have been shared. First, I'd like to call on the Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Trade and Industry, Mr. Richard Nguyen-Shuti, to help and start us off on this section of the meeting. Richard, over to you. Perhaps, as the Honorable Minister excuses himself, as he had earlier mentioned, if we can get support from the technical team to just take the mic to the discussants where they are, I think you can speak from there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Digitoni. First, let me thank the team that worked on the report. I think this is a very insightful report. Indeed, as mentioned in the opening remarks by the Minister and the country director, there is some insightful information here. And I think the recommendations are resounding. Two, I believe, yes, there is a very good trajectory of the trade performance that we have been registering over the last 2 decades, and I think that should be fully acknowledged, and we appreciate that we look at that. And particular to that, the double performance on the logistic performance index is a communication here. I think this really, to my understanding, sets the ground for a sustainable growth. The government taking that initiative with the development partner, with different partners to see that there's a strong investment in our trade logistics, sets the ground with the private sector to make sure that this trade performance is sustained. And I think the Global Logistic Index took note of that. But to really sustain it, and even in the context of the resilience, the report also brings it clear. I think we are moving from a zone where we've all learned that trade is aligned to different dynamics and things keep changing. One to it is the lessons learned during this COVID period. This is really a lesson, and I would say a couple of things that should be underscored here. During the COVID period, how was trade performing even when it was performing? Some of these aspects calls us, as rightly put by the report, that we need to have new generations of trade policies that even projects, God forbid, possible scenarios going forward. Here, going digital is one aspect to it. Really looking at how we invest into digital trade can be one of the options. But the other part of it is to really see how the continued harmonization within the regional trade is also facilitated. Second to this, I note that yes, Rwanda's performance in the regional, particular regional trade has also stagnated, as you mentioned, but there are underlining also lessons here that we also be undertaking. For example, even in the midst of these challenges, talk about COVID and some geopolitical dynamics, trade has been performing at a good rate. I was telling people that even with our current state with our partner in the Western, trade is performing, which means that there is some ways that we can strategize trade even in the midst of some of these global challenges, let it be health or political issues. And I think this is where the new generation of trade policies should be thought through. The other aspect that I also want to comment on the report is the understanding of the interest around taking advantage of the CFTA. I think the strength of the CFTA is built on our regional trading blocks and how we perform into that. And indeed, I appreciate the point where we look at to what extent can we exploit the opportunity of Rwanda sitting in the middle of ESC and ECAS, because that is an opportunity. As you most of you have noted, over time, we have looked at new markets. There have been growing new markets, proximity markets. Look at Zimbabwe, Zambia, Central African Republic, Mozambique. These are new markets that are emerging. How, to what extent can us, I think within the CFTA arrangement, but also within these regional economic blocks, can we harmonize procedures to facilitate this trade? Because that is really a pointer in the right direction. And if these procedures can be harmonized, it can probably support whatever is not working in the ESC, because private sector has different opportunities to pick on, which is other markets that are available. So it's really a window of opportunity that we need to look at. But the other play to it, which we need to also be looking at in the CFTA context is, and I think it was also brought out in the report, is to what extent do we diversify our trade exports? Because in the ESC, it was clearly mentioned, probably one of the reasons is that we all have a similar trading products. So to what extent do we, and when I said do we, even the private sector should take note of this, to what extent do we diversify our trading opportunities versus the traditional exporting goods? Maybe we need to look at services, and I think government has been steering this. Should we be looking at facilitating trade, different services, looking at how we position our country as a logistic hub to facilitate trade, but also private sector needs to look at to what extent, what are the cooperative advantages even in the midst of similar market of goods and services within the region. And I think that is a food for thought for us to keep on thinking through. Otherwise, we find that ESC particularly, we seem to have a similar trading products and mostly services, but there are opportunities that probably we need to explore there. Lastly, and I think it was even mentioned in the report, we need to look at the CFTA, but also look at the skilling part and capacity building part. Even in building our service sector, there is also need to see what are the skills gaps that needs to be supported. And this is goes to different sectors. And here I come back to the digital part, e-commerce. Yes, we can't do much as a country in the digitizing of our private sector to trade beyond the borders. But I think there is still a gap, because this is one of the industry that is still at infancy stage, but has heavily invested government infrastructure that needs to really be taken advantage of. So there is that opportunity that we have capacity gaps within our skilling, but also in other sectors, different sectors that we need to support. So capacity building is building skills that support this digitization transition is an area that needs to be supported. Lastly, there is an aspect here that maybe needs to be thought about, is the need to tie industrialization with trade. Particularly when it comes to what government has been working on, putting up the special economic zone, putting up the industrial zones, but also looking at how we attract the FDI to really invest in this for the opportunity of the wider continental market. Today we are no longer serving the regional 200 million people. We are looking at 1 billion. So that FDI catch opportunity needs to also be fully communicated, because trade is about even industrialization. It's really about us to really up our game when it comes to what we produce internally that can reach out to the market, that the continental market that we are all envisioning. And I think investing in industrialization is very key. It could also be a drive to integration. I always say there are things that we cannot, even in our strategy to have manufacturing sector grow, there are certain resources that we do not have, but we can, in our regional trading, can benefit from each other. And that requires us to have negotiation with our regional countries that are around. So industrialization tied to trade policy is now a way to go, particularly when it comes to CFTA. But within that, attraction of FDI should be the embedment of that. And I think that clearly comes out in the report. Maybe I'll come back to other points later. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, PS. I think this point that you've just concluded on, tying industrialization to trade policy, is critical for trade and certainly for developing regional value chains that can help spur that industrialization and that increased trade. To follow up on the PS's remarks statement is Mr. Sebastian Dessas, the manager of the Global Trade Unit at the World Bank and one of the contributors to this trade report. So over to you, Sebastian. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity. I'm very pleased to be here with you today. It's my second day in Rwanda ever, although I've been working for 13 years in Africa. And I can say confidently that Rwanda has always been seen from different parts of Africa as a champion in terms of its commitment to develop and its effectiveness to develop, and in a sustainable manner. And I'd say that today Rwanda is even more needed than ever, given the global tensions that we see, disruptions in value chains, calls for reshoring, deglobalization, fragmentation, etc. That makes it clear ever that Africa really needs to leverage its internal forces at the margin to grow. And regional integration is, of course, a very important driver for that. So I'm not going to discuss the report itself, but maybe say a few things on where to take it from there in terms of implementation, building on the experience that was gathered in various parts of the world in terms of implementing effectively free trade agreements. Again, to maximize the benefits that have been mentioned by Marila and Calvin before in terms of exports, jobs, and investment that the country can attract. Of course, signing the agreement is a first step, but it's only a first step, and it needs to be followed up by what I can call a complementary agenda that has maybe 3 fronts. The first one is, of course, to follow up on the implementation of the agreement itself, of the commitments and the disciplines that any country has been signing up to. As part of this first front too, there's clearly a need to identify the complementary reforms through a gap analysis that your legal framework has to adopt to really be in line and in sync with the agreement. There is a need as well to engage in a dialogue immediately with the private sector to make sure that the different features of the agreement are well understood, as well, I think, with the broader public in terms of communication on the benefits and the challenges, the opportunities of what this agreement brings. I think it's very important to have a very strong communication campaign with the private sector and with the public at large. The second front, which I think is important, is the one that deals with actions that need to be taken beyond what the Ministry of Trade can do itself. This is coordination with other agencies that are involved in the implementation of this agreement. We've discussed so far, and I think Marila made it very clear that trade facilitation is very important, and that brings all the agencies at the customs and beyond the borders that are involved with custom clearances and trade facilitation more broadly. And in itself, it's a huge coordination undertaking to make sure that we trade facilitation improve significantly. We also have the investment agenda, the competition policy agenda, and more broadly, maybe the industrial policy agenda that needs also to come along and be coordinated to make sure that, again, we implement correctly this trade facilitation agenda. And the third aspect, of course, is direct support to firms to benefit from the trade. And we've been talking about the skills mismatches. We're talking about investment promotion, export promotion, and all the things that does the board, for instance, I think are extremely important. So it requires a lot of coordination to really move on. Now, what can the World Bank do? What can the World Bank do to help there? I think the first thing that we can do and that we do to make sure that, we see some traction is, of course, to bring some diagnostics. And this is what we are doing today, as we have been done. Provide the evidence, the global knowledge, the cross-country comparison to really understand where countries are at and what are the challenges and opportunities. And I think that this, we've already achieved that. I'm not going to come back on that, but it provides, I think, a very strong platform, a sound platform for discussion. Now, the second thing that the World Bank can help with, of course, with many others, and in particular, of course, with authorities taking the lead, is in the identification of country-specific solutions. And this is what we are discussing today. And I mean, it's the beginning of a discussion, or it's a continuation of a discussion on what can be realistically be done in a given country, given the institutions, given the geography, given the political economy, given the priorities of the government to advance this agenda. We are having sessions this afternoon to go more in details on those aspects, to try to start identifying solutions, practical solutions, actionable solutions to progress. And then when it comes to supporting the implementation of those solutions, then again, the bank can bring financing for technical assistance, for investments, the infrastructure and trade facilitation, the institution that needs to support the agreement, and of course, development policy financing that Roland mentioned this morning, which I think is a great opportunity, in particular for Rwanda, the DPO, the budget support operation, to generate a momentum, a focus on the key set of actions that the government needs to undertake. And it requires a lot of coordination, but this development policy operation brings the focus and the attention of the various parts of the government to act on the very series of very specific items to make progress. It brings a calendar of action that are being monitored, results that are being monitored, etc. And I think that's also something that can help any country, and Rwanda in particular, to move on. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. I think really, and this is where we need to focus our efforts, is on the implementation. As the minister highlighted earlier, a lot of the negotiations for the FCFTA have concluded, and indeed to benefit from the FDI deep analysis that Marla presented, it requires that we now move beyond that, and some of the practical elements that you've just shared, I think, touch on those. And so to hand it over to our next discussant, who will be joining us virtually, Andrew Mould, who's the chief of the regional integration and AFCFTA cluster at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Andrew, can you hear us? Are you online?
Yes, I can indeed, yes. Tony,
okay,
yeah.
great. Over to you, if you can just increase your volume. Good morning.
Sure. Okay. Let me just work on that. So it's okay. Firstly, I'd just like to thank you for the invitation to speak at this event. This is a very welcome report. Any report on trade performance in the region is much welcome from our point of view. I agree with some of the main arguments of the report about the essential area of services, of the ambition of making Rwanda a regional logistics hub. Re-exports account for around 30% of total exports for Rwanda. So clearly, being a regional logistical hub would be beneficial. I have to say, though, I have a slightly different strategic take on a couple of elements in the report, which I'd just like to highlight very quickly. The first one is the assessment of the EAC seems a bit unduly pessimistic in my viewpoint. I think we've learned from Brexit, actually, there's dangers from turning your back on your nearest trading partners, neighbouring trading partners. And I have to say that's also true for Rwanda and the EAC. I think there's still a lot of potential trade growth from the EAC bloc. We don't tend to see that in the simulations that we undertake because, of course, the tariffs have been removed. So those simulations don't give very encouraging results. But I think that underestimates the potential for greater trade. In the presentation this morning, you rightly pointed out some of the trade disputes which have happened with Burundi and Uganda, which has clearly undermined the potential of the EAC market for Rwanda in recent years. But I'm encouraged by examples such as Kenya and Tanzania. Under the previous administration in Tanzania, there wasn't a particularly proactive perspective on the EAC. And subsequently, you saw Tanzanian trade to the bloc waning. But with the new administration under President Sahulu, there's been efforts there to remove non-tariff barriers between the two countries. And now Tanzania is exporting more to Kenya than Kenya exports to Tanzania. So I think, by the removal of non-tariff barriers, and I'm very optimistic that a lot of these trade disputes in the region are going to be resolved in the next couple of years, I think you'll see greater potential for intra-EAC trade. My second point is, while I support the idea that Rwanda has to leverage fully its advantages in services, it shouldn't be done to the neglect of manufacturing. My reading of the literature here is that you may not want to propose to a country like Rwanda, which, as the report points out, is landlocked, so raises a lot of the transport costs. You might not want to propose that it becomes a hub of manufacturing and really focuses on that. But I do believe there's a lower limit below which a country shouldn't go in terms of its own manufacturing capacity. And Rwanda still, the manufacturing GDP is around 5-6% of GDP, so that is pretty low. And so ideally, you'd like to see the manufacturing sector expand. The report repeats on several occasions, the importance of the DRC market for Rwanda. And of course, that is being built on the back of manufacturing exports to the country, whether that's in food processing or things like roof tiles and mattresses. And I think that's the way to go in terms of economic diversification. I mean, the report also notices how important manufacturing is for process innovation, for example. There's a lot of theoretical reasons why manufacturing is still important, and I would just say that the emphasis needs to be balanced in a report like this. A final strategic difference would be the report seems to be encouraging more firms getting involved in trade. So I think there's a number that was cited: 11% of companies were exporting in 2006, and that had raised to 21% in 2019. I have some misgivings about encouraging small companies to engage in trade. Firstly, because it exposes smaller companies to risk, and there's a lot of risks involved with cross-border trade and transactions. But secondly, I think it doesn't really characterize how global trade is driven globally. There was a wonderful study by Caroline Freund at the World Bank a few years ago where she looked at 40 developing countries and focused on the top 5 exporters. And in all the countries, it accounted for around half of export growth and almost all the export diversification over the period under study. And I think that's representative of the patterns of global trade generally. I mean, even in the US, I believe of the 5.5 million firms in one study from a few years ago, they were saying existed in the US, is about 4% of companies who actually exported. So this is, not to just criticize this report. I think the UN system also, we oversell the thing of SMEs in trade. And I think we need to rebalance the discourse a little bit to talk about, the larger companies which are responsible for the bulk of trade. And that brings me to my last point about data, actually. And it was welcome to hear about FDI this morning. Foreign direct investment, as we know, is one of the leading drivers of cross-border trade. And we would want to see a lot more cross-border trade under the cross-border investment under the AFCFTA. That's the way to really increase levels of intra-African trade very quickly. But some of the figures were a little bit misleading. I think so. For example, it was saying that half of the investment stock in Rwanda is currently from the African continent, and that's true on paper. But of course, a large share of that, around a quarter, is Mauritius. And Mauritius, it's a lot of companies which are using Mauritius as a staging post, basically, for investing in the rest of the region. And so if you take that out, I think you'll find that the intra-African FDI component is somewhat lower, but it's still a very important force to bear in mind. And my very final point is actually the dependence of the report on revealed comparative advantage exercises. Now, I have some misgivings about that kind of approach, simply because it tends to tell countries to export in areas where they already exported quite a lot. It doesn't help countries identify prospects for diversification. And there's a very wonderful paper by Ben Shepherd about how misleading is revealed comparative advantage. And he says in that paper, he finds that the degree of observed variation in revealed comparative advantage explains only about 1% of the productivity differences, in differences between countries explains only about 1% of the variation in revealed comparative advantage. So it's not a very helpful tool for policymakers. I think we have to do better. I know there's a lot of work that's done on economic complexity, the work that Ricardo Hausmann did. That also sometimes gives some rather strange results when you actually look at the data for a country like Rwanda. So I recently saw UNCTAD released a report showing this, and it was suggesting that Rwanda had opportunities for exporting, I think, machinery and motors to the US market. That was its biggest thing. And you feel, this is a problem with the underlying data. Sometimes the underlying data in these exercises are counting re-exports instead of total exports. So just, a last word of caution there about being too literal in the interpretation of some of these indexes. I think as economists, we need to find better ways of helping country to identify new areas for economic diversification. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Indeed, I think your intervention is very insightful, certainly in terms of some of these patterns of trade. I think your view on SME involvement in trade is certainly very interesting, and I can see in the room you'll get some conversation in terms of whether that's the right strategy and how to go about that. But certainly, I think one that should open up discussion, and I think from some of the other analysis we've done, just looking at the survivability of firms and exports, you tend to find that larger firms perform better, but I'll leave that for the next section. And so next discussant for us, and really to take us into the broader Q&A is Ms. Lucy Nshuti-Mbabazi, who is the lead for Africa Advocacy and Partnership at the Better Than Cash Alliance at the United Nations Capital Development Fund. So I'd hand it over to Lucy for her statement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and congratulations on this report. I think the more we know, the more we are able to make informed investment decisions. So thank you, World Bank, for that. And I really appreciate the openness. The minister said we believe in trade. We are ready to learn. Don't just look at the report. Tell us where we should be improving. The optimist in me wants to look at the opportunities that I see in the report, especially around the private sector. Obviously, government is there to enable the environment for private sector to come in and really thrive in taking advantage of the opportunities. And I'm sure that government is working to address this. The opportunity in manufacturing is really exciting to see, manufacturing and services. And I loved seeing the potential for growth in wages for the low-skilled, or I should say the labor-intensive parts of the economy. I also loved the recommendations on e-commerce and formal training, because I see my passion area is digitization, in case people don't know, and the huge opportunity that comes in digitization of the just everything that we do around trade as an enabler to simplify things. And I want to focus on the part that I didn't see in the report, which is the approximately, well, the estimated 43% of traders that have been living in a continental free trade area for so long at the land borders. Because unfortunately, they're not counted in the intra-African trade, and yet they do this on a daily basis. They're crossing every day in the thousands to buy and sell goods. And obviously what we don't see, we can't count, and therefore cannot solve for challenges that they face. So I really would love to the elevating of the cross-border trader. As much as they are migrant small, they come in the millions across the continent, and for Rwanda, I believe there are tens of thousands that are crossing at any given border on a daily basis. And so parking it there from a digitization opportunity, there is no trade without payments. I would have loved to see, and I think it's important for the next report or as we track progress, the digitization of payments, because it's such a catalyst for access to finance. And we know that at the land borders, that is primarily cash. And unfortunately, they bear the brunt of having to convert money twice and therefore suffer losses in their small profits because they have to convert as they cross to Tanzania, to the shilling, and back to the Rwandan franc, which is a double loss. But when that payment is digitized, there is one regulated FX conversion and really can help to further improve the wages. So a spotlight on digital payments and how well they are serving traders, how much we need to invest in making them happen, especially as a catalyst for digital skills and financial literacy. They simplify access to learning. So anything, everyone that has a mobile phone has a classroom in place, has a bank account in place. It's just a matter of activating that. So really spotlighting the digitization opportunity, especially for the micro and small traders that dominate. I think what's typically the perspective I have here is for the more small to medium enterprises that are covered generally by trade policies, and I looked upon, but the most excluded at the borders, I think, need to come out, and that is a huge investment opportunity, I believe, from a national and regional perspective. I did learn a few things that I would take back to the protocol on digital trade that we are supporting the CFTA in developing, especially on the data wealth that really is sitting in receipt books, in cash transactions that we can be able to capitalize on. I noted the localization of data that is required by Rwanda. I think in the One Africa market, that liberalization to where data can sit in any one of the 55 countries. I'm hoping Eritrea will come on board sometime soon, is something that we really need to think about, especially also from a rules of origin perspective. So for me, it's the catalyzing the voices that I represent that at the land borders, elevating the opportunity in investing in them, especially on digitizing payments as a catalyst for a lot of data that we need, and especially to improve access to finance that will meaningfully contribute to the development of these businesses that are much excluded today from the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lucy. I think you bring a fresh and different perspective to this report. Certainly highlighting, I think, the role of informal traders is very important because they represent such a big number of trade on the continent, a huge number of trade on the continent, and their participation into maybe more formalized trade, I think, is important to highlight. And we've had these discussions with Andrew in the past as well of the contribution of informal traders to intra-Africa trade. And of course, them being SMEs as well. So it'll be interesting to hear that dynamic and that discussion. But certainly payments, I think, is also very important in how we integrate more digital payments to facilitate cross-border trade. So at this point, I think our discussants have done a good job of helping to lay the groundwork for us to open the stage for questions, comments, answers. And so I'm going to open it up to the public, both in the room and online. I understand there is somebody online who would like to speak. So hand it over to you, Stephen. I think he's the CEO of PSF. Are you online? Can you hear us?
Hello, Tony. Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can hear you. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Once again, let me also echo my friends who have commented earlier on. Thanks for the report that is exhaustive. We're covering almost everything in terms of trade and export growth. My comment will basically focus on expanding exports. And even here, I will pick on the services. In the report, when I joined, there was a mention that in terms of export base, product base, export
Stephen,
base,
please
is
put
almost
on camera.
exhausted. Sorry?
Can you put your camera on?
We can hear you, CEO. Please continue.
Okay. I was advised to show my face. I hope you can see me now. Hello?
Yes, now we can see you.
All right. Thank you
Great.
so much.
Thank you.
Apologies again. I'm using my phone, so Ruthie will help me to increase the digitalization and get a better device. So, as I said, I'll base much on the export base, expanding our export base. I agree with the PS Minicom, Mr. Richard. We need to, PSF private sector participants have to come in and improve on the base. And I was thinking in lines of ICT, in terms of export services, probably we have to look at things like ICT. There is a number of ICT products that can be exported from Rwanda to the neighboring countries, both in EAC and even outside EAC. The other one would be TVET. There's a little bit or a great effort that has been done in terms of improving TVET services, and we have a number of products in TVET sector that can be exported to other products, to other countries. So I believe that is something that has to be taken into consideration, both at the government level and private sector level participation. However, allow me to use a caveat. However, trade is an exchange of goods and versus money with the facilitation of regulations. And regulations at times are influenced by the government. And if you look at the levels of regulations, we are not at the same level. The countries are different levels in terms of trade regulations, either for production, which is manufacturing, or even exports. Our FDS are not at the same level in terms of standardization. We have different players in the sector in terms of regulation. And as PS had highlighted, I believe it is of great importance that we have to harmonize our regulations. A number of agreements have been signed, BATs, trade agreements, concessions, but we haven't seen yet a greater impact of these signed agreements. Mutual recognition agreements have been signed in EAC, but if you, in terms of output, we have not yet really benefited much through these agreements. If you go to the countries where you have signed mutually recognized agreements, you are required to go through other processes of certifying your services, registering here and there, a number of requirements. At least I saw in the room, members of in private sector probably will have a chance and come out and mention some of the challenges. So those are some of the challenges which I believe World Bank and other stakeholders could facilitate in terms of assisting the penetration of export in service sectors. So that is in terms of digitalization. Today, in terms of trade diversification, there is the global trend. Countries globally are taking different initiatives, but if you look at the biggest percentage, they are focusing much on ICT digitalization. Things are online payments, mobile money is coming up and is almost taking over the banks. So those are some of the things which I think we can no longer resist, but we have to increase in their penetration more. Let me end up with the cross-border movements. If you look, as Tony said and both mentioned, the most participants of trade cross-border movements are ladies or women, plus youth, and youth again who are girls. If you look at the boys, they are either hunting or playing football or dodging schools here and there. But the distance crossed from either side of the border is not more than 50, 60 kilometers. So people are crossing over the country to buy things which they are going to put in their boutiques or the markets. And we need to put up facilities at the cross border that help these people to get their services where possible with online payments, because there is a risk again of losing their money along the corridors or along the borders. And if you capture the loss, much as there's a lot of increase in the trade across the borders, if we capture the loss they face in terms of their goods and money paid, there is a big challenge that will have to be addressed here. With your permission, allow me to end here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, CEO. I think the perspective from the private sector is very important, and certainly your perspective, I think, brings important elements to this discussion, real, tangible, I think, implementation challenges and gaps that we see. Certainly, I think in the MRA discussion, this is one of the challenges we always see. We do have an MRA with the EAC on legal services, but implementation of this is certainly a challenge and one that we face regularly. So open it up to audience, both online and in the room. Anybody who has a comment, and take one from Diane from RDB. Over to you. And if we can have colleagues just help with getting mics to the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony. Good morning, everyone. Let me also thank the presenters and those who work on this very interesting report. It's very informative, and it's giving us really an overview, a picture on where we are in terms of exports. So I have a few comments. Number one, regarding the FEM's Revo analysis. Yes, it shows again a picture at the company level, but I think it will add more value if we also look at the sizes of those exporters. Because among the exporters, over 90% they are small businesses. You were talking about the small businesses. And as we are doing analysis and exploring different ways of increasing exports, we shall look at a way of increasing $1 million exporters so that it has a very significant impact on the total export volumes. My second comment is on incentives. Somewhere in the document, they are talking about incentives. And I want also to come back on these incentives we are providing to export-oriented investors. Maybe in the next report, we will be happy to see an analysis as well on the impact of those incentives we are providing to the overall export revenues. Number three, it's a comment on the diversification of our export in general. Yes, it's good that the report is mainly focusing on services as a way of diversifying our exports, but it's also important to look at value-added products, manufacturing products. If you are talking about coffee, how can we really export like a high-end coffee, value-added coffee, same thing with tea and other export we are sending out of the country. So I can say that diversification is also another important point, mainly on the goods, not only for the services. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. Yeah, I think from your practical experience in export promotion, size of export is very important to look at. Comments, questions? Colleagues who have access to online can let me know if anybody is online. Sure. Sure. We can have, I think, various discussants presented some comments, so give it over to you and Marla to come in at this stage. Thanks. Sure. Go ahead, Patience.
Thank you. Yeah, let me join colleagues in congratulating the World Bank as well as the Secretariat on this report. It's very interesting and quite informative. Maybe a few things that stood out for me. I'm Patience Motesi from Trademark East Africa. I had just a few comments. Number one, on the logistics LPI, positioning Rwanda as a logistics hub in the region. I felt like the report missed out a key component on the opportunities to leverage internal water systems to develop inland water systems, not only in Rwanda, but the rest of the region as well. So we're piloting something along Lake Kivu, and we think that there's a huge opportunity to reduce trade costs for cross-border trade, specifically between Rwanda and DRC. But I think there's also huge opportunities with Lake Tanganyika, with Lake Victoria, opportunities that have not been fully mined. And then the second item is on non-tariff barriers. I felt like the report focused a lot on reporting of non-tariff barriers. But one of the things we've learned is that beyond the reporting of non-tariff barriers, what mechanisms are in place to actually make sure that those non-tariff barriers are resolved. So strengthening of national trade facilitation committees in country. I think more needs to be done to make sure that those are the NTBs that are reported are actually resolved on time. And then I also wanted to hear from the team maybe around the high costs, internal costs of transportation or trading. It's something that we've also noticed, because if you're going to get companies to export, first you need to be able to resolve the internal trade costs beyond the costs outside. If Rwanda is exporting the same commodities as our peer countries in the region, I think the opportunity that we have to actually increase those the exports from Rwanda lies in how much we can push those trade costs lower. So what strategies are in place? And I'm asking this question so that we can get an idea on where should we focus in order for us to push down these trade costs internally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patience. I think this last point is critically important, looking at from farm to market. And so we'll give it back to the presenters to share their thoughts, inputs, and feedback on these questions. And then we'll come back for another round of questions. Over to you, Phil.
Thank you. I'm going to start, and other team members will complete. Yes, just to really sincerely thank our discussant for very, very rich comments. We take all those comments on board. And after this session, we are going to have a closed-door discussion on our recommendations. I believe that many of these comments that we receive from discussion will definitively contribute to the outcome of discussion that we are having after this. Yes, just a few words in terms of the types of firm, how we are discussing the participation of the firm to international trade. Yes, the point is well taken that we should also be tracking, in fact, the firm per size. But I just want to say that overall, the point of the report is that we have a relatively small country in terms of size, and having access to international or regional trade, in fact, is going to help those firms, in fact, to improve the scale, improve their productivity, to have the possibility to import, to be in contact with the international technology and grow. So that's the basic point behind this, but definitely we get the point that to really have the full picture distinction by size of the firm have to be made. And yes, the World Bank Enterprise Survey, in fact, provide that possibility. And it also gives us the possibility, in fact, to track the different incentives. I just want to talk about the other question that was around this area. Yes, to talk about the impact of the incentive, because in that same survey, you know, in fact, to what extent the firms are exporting, what are the number of employees that they have, how they are paying them, what is their skill. And yes, so these are definitively maybe future area of work that we see are definitely and completely doable, given the data that we could have in our different survey. And I think that the other point was about the use of revenue comparative advantage in the report. I just want to say that discussing the trade performance, the trade potential in the report, we use the revenue comparative advantage just as one of the indicators. So this indicator, in fact, comes with the other series of tools to assess the potential that we have in the report, including a gravity model where you take into account the localization of the country, the history of the country, the endowment of the country in terms of the factor. So all these are all the things that are used in the report, in fact, to discuss the potential of trading of the country. The review comparative advantage is just one of the aspects that we have in there. Now, I really like, in fact, that the discussion around the cross-border trade. In fact, yes, we have this in the report. Actually, our collaboration with the Central Bank of Rwanda was really, in fact, meant to develop this aspect of the work. And they have a very, very rich database on informal cross-border trade that we use here. And we have a couple of numbers in the report that this trade, for example, represents 3% of total trade, 9% of trade in goods, 82% of that is going to DRC. This stress again, in fact, the importance of the trading with that particular destination, and really your perspective in terms of the types of the barrier that this trade is facing, notably in terms of the payment, the need, in fact, to digitalize, in fact, to improve the payment. This is very much welcome. I think that's going to be useful in the conversation that we are having after this meeting here. Yes, so there were a series of questions on the trade facilitation and logistics. Maybe I will leave that to Charles, our trade facilitation and logistics expert. But maybe before that, Marila, if you have something to also say here, please, I think that you can go ahead. And then Charles will address the question on trade facilitation. There were also questions on services. I believe that Bernard could also help addressing those questions on trade in services. If she's there.
Thank you so much. There are not that many questions specifically on the AFCFTA analysis, but I think all of the issues that have been mentioned are critical for the AFCFTA as well. And I noted that we need to pay quite a lot more importance to the cross-border trade. And we have a bit of a discussion on that in the report, but we're missing really the data on this. So it's critical to start collecting data information. And indeed, the trade report has already some information on Rwanda, but it's something that will be definitely dedicating much more time into, especially as we talk about the protocol on women in trade. I mean, not looking into cross-border trade would be just missing most of the story. So for sure, we plan to dedicate more attention, resources into looking into it. But yeah, I'll also turn it over to Charles, maybe to talk about the Great Lakes Trade Facilitation Project, how this has affected the small-scale traders, because you have great results that you have your own. Okay, cool.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to say a few words and for the comments and questions. So fully agree with the sentiments that were expressed earlier on the small-scale trade. So the World Bank has been supporting an operation actually to facilitate small-scale trade on the western boundary of Rwanda and eastern boundary of DRC, including also Uganda. And we have since scaled up that operation to include Burundi. So I think the issues that were raised that this small-scale trade actually supports livelihoods of millions of people on the continent. In fact, at some of the border crossing points between Rwanda and DRC, there were before COVID as many as 70,000, 80,000 people crossing each day, carrying small consignments back and forth. So that is very well taken. And we have, perhaps we do not talk about this as much as our management in the World Bank would like us to do. We do not talk about some of the solutions we have also been piloting, including digital solutions to enable this. And Rwanda has been a leader in this space, for instance, in introducing e-gate systems, for instance, in Rubavu for small-scale traders, so that they can cross without passports and so on. And this has already brought tremendous benefits. So this is a topic that we can discuss. And of course, we have been working very closely with Minicom, and the PS has been one of the champions in implementing that project. So this is very well taken. And then the comment from Ms. Mtesi, TMEA, on inland water transport and including this in the report. Perhaps it's not as prominent as it could have been, and that's for some reasons that I'll state in a minute. We have sort of incorporated this in the proposal, in the recommendation on multimodal transportation, and this is in recognition of the limited extent of the waterway transport networks. So they are patchy, right? So you have Lake Kivu, you have Lake Tanganyika, you have Lake Victoria, but they're in separate places. So you need to connect this with road transport or railway transport. Those of you who know economic history in this region know that we used to have the East Africa Ports and Harbors Corporation. So the colonial administrations already accepted that you needed to link up the transport systems, the waterway, railway, and roads systems. However, over the past 2 decades or so, we fragmented these into separate railway operations from roads, from inland waterways. So the multimodal proposal is really to stitch these back together again. And most of it is not infrastructure, but it's in terms of how you provide for contracts for end-to-end shipments across different modes of transport. Then very quickly, lastly, on the high costs of transport, this is an interesting one, and I'm looking forward to the discussion we are going to have after this session. So you'll find that in the report, we have sort of gone in 2 different ways. There is a proposal to introduce cabotage. If you have got lower costs on the international corridors, then why should the costs be higher at the domestic level? So there must be something about the functioning of the markets within the individual countries that may need to be addressed. Alternatively, as we have seen in other countries also, is to provide support to the trucking sector in the individual countries. So the entry costs may be too high, and we find that the markets within individual countries may not be as competitive as they need to be, and therefore prices tend to be high. And we observe this in many, many other places as well. I stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all very much for the responses there. We'll take maybe another round of questions if there are. So I'll open it up. If not, I see 1, 2, 3. Maybe take these 3 and then we can close from here. So let's start with gentleman in the back. Martin, if I'm not mistaken.
Thank you so much, Tony. Great. Martin. I'm called Martin from Africa Improved Foods, Rwanda. Very good ideas, brilliant ideas I heard from the discussants. especially with regards to the innovations that are being picked up. Talk about the digitization mentioned by Lucy, if I'm not mistaken, then very good ideas from the PS as well. My question here is, by the way, also from Trademark East Africa Country Direct. My question is, how do we move from these, how do we move forward with regards to resolutions taken? We've had solutions that are actually have come up. So in matters of dissemination of what has been discussed today, how will the beneficiaries, the stakeholders were in this conference be given a feedback so that we're on the same page of those very good initiatives that were picked up today. My second point and last is definitely these rising costs in transportation and logistics, mainly triggered by partly the COVID, but also dynamics in the supply chain, have really had a diverse impact on bottom lines of very many corporates in Rwanda. So this also triggers another aspect of the insurance in matters of covers, or what I would call cover placements for these particular perils which are developing day by day. And my view here was, or my take, that in your conclusions, let's concurrently look at all these issues. The bottlenecks we have, but also we look in matters of mitigations, how we tackle this insurance aspect, because day by day the premiums are going extremely high. And I think having to look at both these issues in the same mirror would probably take us to a next level of desired results. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Martin, for that. I think it's always important to hear perspective from private sector, and certainly this point on where do we go from here and how does it actually come back, I think is what we'll be discussing this afternoon. Mr. Bernard Holkman, over to you. I think it's okay.
Should I speak or not?
Yeah, go ahead. It's okay.
Okay, sorry. No, I just wanted to pick up on some of the comments that were made, especially with respect to services. So I think this point that has come up a number of times on manufacturing versus services is the wrong way to think about this, right? What we should be thinking about is how do you increase value added in terms of the activities that occur. And a lot of what is needed to actually become competitive in manufacturing requires a whole set of services inputs. And the empirical literature that shows clearly that large firms dominate world trade, once you unpack what is going on inside these large firms, there's lots of small firms feeding into those large firms. So I think it's a bit semantics. I know people tend to get focused on manufacturing, on industry. Services is clearly 60, 70% of GDP as countries become richer. So I don't find it a particularly useful way of thinking. We should really be thinking in terms of where's the value added, where can we add value, and where can we actually make, from a private sector perspective, where can we make more money? We need to walk on two legs. I think the informal sector, the informal border trade, the scope for digitization is a very good example of where, if you start thinking about how services can be part of the solution to lower trade costs and to increase margins for traders, whether those are small firms or large firms, that again is low-hanging fruit, right? And I think the real issue then is to think about how do you encourage that? How do you support that from happening? And I think the point that was made Thanks. The point that was made by the CEO in terms of looking at how regulations actually impact in real time is a very important one, right? So I think we trade economies, we like to look at barriers at the border, but increasingly as we're moving into a digital world, those barriers are behind the border and they're really related to regulatory regimes, which often are put in place not because of trade, right? They're put in place to protect consumers, they're put in place for various regulatory objectives, but we need to think about how can we reduce the trade impact of those regulations without undercutting the objective of the regulation. So I think the point that was made by Lucy saying, think Africa instead of think national in terms of data protection, in terms of the, the digital regulatory agenda is a very important one, that it can very much facilitate trade in services, in digital transactions. One final point I wanted to make, which I think came from Patience. If we think about what has been done to facilitate trade in goods, there's been a huge amount of work done. Partly that is through these national trade facilitation committees, right, which are a focal point for trying to think about what do we need to do as a country to facilitate trade. We don't have that for services. We don't have that for digital. So I think one of the things thinking forward is how can you emulate that type of an approach where the private sector can actually work with the government, bring forward issues where there actually are constraints so that you can actually have a concrete discussion about concrete problems and try and resolve them, right? So I think we need to kind of bring some of the lessons from the goods world to the services world there. And I think we'll talk about that this afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bernard, for that. I think certainly as Minicom is also the focal point for the NTFC, this is also something we need to start thinking about. Kevin in the back, and then we'll come back to Charles here for the final comment question. Over to you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kevin from the Netherlands Embassy. I just have 2 points to make. First of all is when you're looking at digitalization and specifically the fintech sector, I think moving forward in terms of the report, some analysis needs to be done on the potential that lies herein within the fintech sector. Because when you're looking at the informal trade, even across the borders, a key problem that a lot of the traders face is access to finance and affordable credit so that you can be able to facilitate that trade. So more insights need to be put into the penetration of fintech, what role private sector is playing in order to enable that. Because within fintech, you have the whole elements of access to finance, you have if it's insurance products, so everything is basically provided through a fintech platform, which will be able to ensure that the trader is able to effectively gain access to affordable credit and do the effective trade, especially when you're looking at the informal trade sector, even tying into the formal trade sector. Secondly is in regards to logistics. I believe that more insights from the internal logistics and also looking at the cross-border logistics, more data, especially reflecting on the private sector, needs to come out more prominently in order just to see what opportunities therein lie in terms of coming up with different logistics solutions that is private sector led. And then last but not least is when you're looking at trade within the context of Rwanda, 70% of the population actively involved in the agricultural sector. So I think specifically within the different agricultural value chains, there should be a certain form of linkage to the data on how these different value chains, what challenges they face, what impact do they have in ensuring that Rwanda is able to the element of adding value, if it's within the coffee value chain, if it's within the horticulture value chain. So the agricultural sector from a trade perspective also needs to come out more, needs to be featured more in order to have a understanding of what are the implications of the agricultural value chain and what positive effects can they have in facilitating and promoting trade. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments. Final question, comment from Charles.
Thank you very much, Tony, and thanks to the World Bank for the report. But my comment is based on what has been discussed here. Looking at the recommendations from the report and also the comments from other participants who have mentioned, Rwanda has been the champion of in terms of changing reforms, new generation policies, being trade and also infrastructure. So if you look at the setup, and then when you look at the setup, try to do the comparison with where we've been coming from in terms of the dimension of the export base. We are seeing numbers increasing, but at a certain level, we are also stuck. So looking at the trade within the region, we seem to be in the same, I don't know how to call it, in the same business. We are trading the same goods and services. So despite of the establishment of these reforms, putting up the infrastructure, the logistics, the patient did mention about the ports we are trying to develop along the coastline of Lake Kivu, looking at the 5 districts, and then be able to trade with DRC and other infrastructure initiatives that have been established, like cross-border infrastructure, looking at development of the new airport that we are planning is coming on board, which is also promotion of being a logistical hub. I have a feeling that we let me use this word, that we are at the take-off stage of trade. I mean, so I think we need to go back and try to reflect on how we need to change, doing business. I haven't heard anything from the report focusing much on comparative advantage. How do we leverage on what we have so that we can be able to position ourselves in the global business community? But we cannot, I mean, yes, we could keep on changing the reforms, like my previous speaker did mention. Let's go back and look at the value chain within agriculture. Where do we have the potential? And then focusing that. So then somebody did mention about the trade costs. I think these other factors, would I call them the conversional factors, or what we need to really focus on. And then try to, I don't think that we move from the policy side. Yes, something has been done and we're still doing that. But let's also try to have the other side that should be focused on in terms of really promoting the export base. Otherwise, we are putting policies, we are putting everything, transport costs, being logistic, but when you don't have what to export, the quality, everything, I mean. So this is my thinking. Also, probably next, going forward from the recommendation, also the report should dive more into quantitative assessment. I mean, on how we can leverage to what we have and what we've established already to be able to position ourselves.
Great. Thank you very much, Charles. Yeah. I think certainly issue of which products and how do we develop these and how do we expand these, I think has been brought up several times. And I think Andrew's perspective was how do we actually move beyond the comparatively advantaged products to maybe more economic complex products, even looking at that analysis. But I think there is that need to balance between the two. What are we competitively good at, but also where do we want to go moving forward? And I think some strategies that the ministry is looking at, whether it's the AfCFTA implementation strategy or the revised trade policy, tries to combine these two assessments and look at where we can orient. But I think there's a lot that can be said, and certainly there's a lot of exciting things that have come from this discussion that we need to take forward. So before I hand it over to Roland to give us the closing for this meeting, just want to share logistics for this afternoon. As you know, we'll have closed door discussions for this afternoon to kind of dig deeper into some of these broad areas. We'll have one discussion on, sorry, let me just get my screen there. Yes. So we'll have one discussion on Rwanda's trade logistics and trade facilitation. We'll have a discussion on investment and, trade in services, investment, and digitalization. And then we'll also have one on AFCFTA, regional integration, and cross-border trade. And really the idea is to dig deeper into some of the findings from this report, the recommendations that have been made, and how do we develop programs and projects around this? So very much to what you were speaking on, some of the focus areas, where do we focus on in manufacturing and trade logistics, and how do we tap into some of the World Bank financing and funding, whether that's the DPO financing, whether that's investment project financing, to help now start to implement, as colleagues from the private sector had raised. And so the first workshop, there's those we had initially invited to participate, but extending this out to everybody who's here, who has time this afternoon to engage in these discussions, welcome you to participate in any of the workshops that you feel are more relevant for your sector and for your work. And so the discussion on trade logistics and trade facilitation will take place here, starting from 1 p.m., I believe. The discussion on trade in services, investments, and digitalization will take place just across from this room. It's called the Inyambo room, so literally just across on the other side. And then the discussion on the AFCFTA, regional integration, and cross-border trade will take place upstairs in the room called Inyange. So logistics, trade facilitation takes place here. Trade and services, investments, and digitalization across the way, and AFCFTA upstairs. And each of these workshops will be facilitated by colleagues from the World Bank. And so for trade logistics, it will be facilitated by Mr. Charles Kanaka. Okay, Kanaka, and discussion on trade and services investments will be facilitated by Bernard Hockman, and then the discussion on FCFTA by Marla and Victor as well. And so really encourage you, if you have time, to stay with us, and we'll be able to delve deeper into this. But we won't take you there right away. We'll ensure that we first feed you, and make sure that you have all of the energy. And I'll come back and give some direction on that after Roland's closing remarks. Roland, over to you.
Never one to stand for a long time between wherever we are now and lunch. I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank all of you who have had the chance to participate here and online. This report that we've worked on with Minicom, everybody's thanking the bank. I have to say that we are thanking Minicom because it has really been a true partnership. There has been a great level of ownership over this report, and the report is only useful because of that level of ownership, collaboration, openness, discussion, and debate. So, DG Tony has been our shining, sort of ambassador on this. And of course, the PS and now, the previous minister and the new minister have all really owned this process. What I would like to say is that we are now standing at the point where I think we move from analysis and debate into action. And so the opportunity of having these workshops this afternoon, some of you may not even have known about them, but this is really a chance to see what is it that we have said here that is useful and that is feasible, in the short term, the medium term, and long term, and what does it take for us to get there? That's kind of the nature of the conversations that we will be having later today. So If there are issues that you feel that you can contribute to, I would really strongly urge you to join us this afternoon for that purpose. I also have benefited a great deal, I think, from today's discussion. And, I point out often that, at the bank, we're kind of, we have thick skin and we like the exchange and debate and the different points of views being addressed. So, the back and forth, for example, between Andrew, who had specific views, and I thank him very much for being a discussant. And then, of course, Bernard, who comes back and says it depends upon what you see. For us, this is sharpening the knife, right? It's us being able to be very, very focused about what the intervention is. And so, I encourage you, I know it's probably maybe not very random to kind of counteract comments that are made, but we feel that these closed door discussions this afternoon are really an opportunity for persons to feel comfortable, to push back when you might see suggestions or recommendations that you think might not be relevant, right? To really have an exchange, because when we walk out of the room together, we want to own a set of actions that we will be able to take forward. And I say we, I mean the government, of course, in the lead, the World Bank in a supporting role, and of course, you others as stakeholders who will benefit and who will also support to essentially to move the country forward. I want to thank, of course, the Honorable Minister, all of the members, the PS, and of course, DG Tony, who did such an excellent job of moderation. I'd like to thank as well Dr. Sebastian de Sus, who is the head, our practice manager for global trade, who is in Rwanda for the first time, but has many of his team members here, and thought that it was important enough for him to come and be a part of the discussions to really frame this going forward. I'd like very much to thank Lucia Mabazi, who of course spoke to the very important issue of cross-border trade. And you see, Lucy, it's actually one of the areas that we're focusing on in the workshops this afternoon. So it's not that we've overlooked it, even though we didn't probably have as much discussion on it in the presentations that were made. And, very much the other institutions like the Ministry of Finance, like the Statistics Bureau and the Central Bank, who gave us this very rich information for our analysis on cross-border trade. This work that we do at the bank, we have a lot of experts, we have a lot of people who are very passionate and engaged, but it will not be impactful and we cannot move it forward without the strong collaboration of government. And it is what I am very thankful for in my role here. It is what I think keeps us successful in Rwanda, and I think will continue to allow us to strengthen and broaden our impact if we are able to walk together in making the strides that are needed to improve regional integration, to improve international trade, essentially to work on what it is that the bank feels is most important, growth and poverty reduction. So I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Country Manager Roland Price, for those remarks. I think good conclusion to our discussion here today. So I also won't stand in your way and lunch much longer, just to indicate that it is just as you exit on your right in the main restaurant, and you should be able to be facilitated on your way out. So thank you all very much for your participation.
A new trade agreement promises to be a game changer for Africa. The African Continental Free Trade Area will unite 55 countries into a single market worth $3.4 trillion by cutting tariffs within Africa and making it easier to move goods across borders. The ambitious agreement also hopes to harmonize the policies of African countries in areas such as digital trade, investment and competition, and intellectual property. Together, these steps could boost growth by 9% on average, lift 50 million people out of extreme poverty by 2035, and create almost 18 million new jobs. A new report explains how. Trade and investment drive growth in developing countries, but Africa's fractured internal market has prevented it from benefiting fully. The smoother flow of trade could raise real income in Africa by almost $300 billion by 2035. The agreement will also open up trade in services such as transport and communications. A single African market with streamlined regulations could almost double foreign investment between African countries themselves. Foreign investment brings know-how and helps firms join regional and global value chains. Deepening trade flows and diversifying to other industries could help reduce Africa's dependence on volatile commodity exports. Exports between African countries, especially in manufactured goods, could double by 2035, with income gains reaching $571 billion. This would create higher paid, better quality jobs, especially for women. Steps to unlock the potential. To realize these gains, the treaty's most ambitious goals must be carried out by each country. That means stakeholders must be involved. Policymakers must analyze the impact on workers and design policies to mitigate risks. Businesses need transparent, pro-trade regulations, and they need to know how they can take advantage of the agreement to boost sales. Finally, trade ministries will need training and advice. A strong permanent secretariat will help administer the agreement. The time for change is now. The next phases of the agreement, how they are concluded and structured, will determine whether trade and investment contribute to a more prosperous Africa.